even people who observe American politics closely may not have known of this man, Jeremy Carl, who is President Donald Trump's nominee for Assistant Secretary of the Bureau of International Organization Affairs at the Department of State. That's a mouthful. At least that was the case until last week, when Jeremy testified in front of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee with other Trump administration nominees, and he was accused by Democrats of being a racist, a misogynist, a bigot, and an anti-Semite. Senator Chris Murphy said Jeremy's nomination was, quote, heartbreaking. Senator Cory Booker told Jeremy, quote, "You have no decency, you have no honor."
Sir, you have no decency. You have no honor. You say inflammatory things because it thinks it will ingratiate you to those who are paying your salary.
And Senator Shaheen finds his, quote, views about women particularly concerning, end quote. Senator Jackie Rosen told the committee that Jeremy's nomination should, quote, alarm every senator who believes in basic decency, truth, and responsibility that does come with public service, end quote. And this is because Jeremy has a history of, quote, vile anti-Semitic comments. As someone who has known Jeremy Carl for a few years, all of this was very surprising to hear. And that's for a few reasons. First, I don't pretend to know Jeremy super well, but I do know that he grew up in a secular Jewish household. He has a Jewish family, and he converted to Christianity as an adult after years of deliberation and a lot of prayer. For him to be an anti-Semite would mean hating his own family. That's first of all. And secondly, believing something fundamentally anti-Christian. Christians don't believe in blood guilt. We don't believe in group punishment, collective punishment. And second, I was surprised by this because Jeremy has devoted his career to being against racism. His book, The Unprotected Class, about institutional discrimination against white people in hiring, college admissions, government benefit programs, he doesn't argue for affirmative action for whites in the book. It argues to dismantle any system that judges people on the basis of their skin color. You know, you could say he's a bit of an anti-racist, that Jeremy Carl. But Democrats tried to smear Jeremy as a racist and an anti-Semite anyways. And they supposedly dug up public statements from articles or podcasts that Jeremy has done in the last 5 years to prove it. On several occasions, they made these accusations they're supposed to destroy his reputation, right? There's no other way to look at this. They're saying this, and they want to destroy his career, his livelihood. And that's without even asking him a question. Can you even respond? The answer was no. They didn't want him to respond. And this is why the American people think Congress is a joke, by the way. Senators and members of Congress can strut into a hearing for 10 minutes. They can make all kinds of accusations to destroy the reputations of the witnesses or the nominees. Oh, racist, anti-Semite. And when the accused individual tries to respond to these allegations, the elected official just cuts them off and reclaims their time. And then when they're done, they get up and walk out of the hearing room as if nothing ever happened. It's psychopath behavior. But what was the supposed evidence of the accusations made by Democrat senators against Jeremy Carl? Well, we went back and we actually looked it up to see if what Democrats were saying was actually true. And what we found is that Jeremy Carl's comments were not just taken out of context. Democrats often gave Jeremy's comments the exact opposite meaning of what he was saying. And Senator Jackie Rosen kind of tipped her hand in the hearing when she said, quote, some may try to excuse Mr. Carl's remarks, claiming his words were taken out of context, end quote. No, that's not an excuse. No one's excusing it. It's not an excuse when someone malevolently takes your words out of context. What it is not true. So let's go through the evidence in the case against Jeremy Carl and see if it stands up to scrutiny. Senator Shaheen said Jeremy's views on women were deeply troubling, if you remember. She takes issue with Jeremy for arguing that, quote, a post-feminist America is one of failing fertility, rapidly rising out of wedlock births, and religious collapse, end quote. This is incontrovertible. The data completely backs this up. Since Betty Friedan's The Feminist Mystique in 1963, the American fertility rate has been cut in half, from 3.3 births per woman to about 1.6 births per woman. Births out of wedlock, meanwhile, has increased from under 10% in the early 1960s to over 35% today. In 1963, religiously unaffiliated adults made up around 5% of the US population. Now it's almost 30%. So Shaheen is just attacking Jeremy for noticing. These are all observable realities, and it's exactly what feminists like Friedan envisioned, by the way. Remember, Betty Friedan called the home and the family a comfortable concentration camp. But Democrat senators also accused Jeremy of being anti-Semitic. In particular, they point to a podcast appearance on the Christian Ghetto podcast in October of 2024, in which the host and Carl are talking about the misunderstandings between Christians and Jews and their communities in the United States. Both of them, by the way, born Jewish and converted to Christianity. But before I get into any of these specific claims, I want to read what Jeremy says towards the beginning of the podcast. This is what he says. Quote, "I have a pretty big disclaimer that probably will help me with any bad actors who happen to listen. But obviously everything I say is going to be a generalization, not going to be true of every, won't even necessarily be true of most Jews that I'm talking about. But we're trying to talk in generalities," end quote. A few seconds later, Jeremy adds, quote, "I have to do that throat clearing because, we're going to get into some sensitive territory. And I do, I still have, of course, with my family of origin, and a lot of friends who are Jewish, so I want to be respectful of that," end quote. So again, we're not judging individuals on the basis of their identity because that's collective punishment. That's wrong. It's anti-Christian and it's anti-Western. Many of the Democrat senators brought up the same out of context, and by out of context, we mean untrue statements made by Jeremy. But perhaps the biggest offender was Senator Jackie Rosen. Jackie Rosen accused Jeremy of making, quote, "vile anti-Semitic comments," end quote, right? And she said his nomination was offensive to anyone who believes in, quote, "basic decency, truth, and responsibility," end quote. Now, she makes all these accusations within the span of about a 5-minute speech, and not once did she ask a question to Jeremy or let him respond to these accusations. And so here's some of her speech.
Mr. Carl, I'd be hard-pressed to find any person in this room, not any of my colleagues, who would agree with many of your statements. I'm going to quote some of them. "The Jews love to see themselves as oppressed." Another one, "Jews have often loved to play the victim, rather accept that they are participants in history." Here's another one. "Hitler is always the convenient kind of bad example." Hitler is always a convenient kind of bad example. Anyone who had family members who served in World War II, I wish they were here to argue with you on that one. "I'm very critical," another thing you said, "of overall political stance and sociology of the Jewish community, particularly in this century. It's been very destructive overall." Another quote, "You guys," referring to the Jews, "are spearheading a lot of bad causes." Okay. Another quote, "We need to unashamedly criticize and critique them," referring to the Jews when they're enemies, without being worried about being called anti-Semites. And finally, in discussing the Holocaust, where 6 million Jews, almost half the Jewish population alive at the time, were slaughtered, an event that continues to be denied to this day, you say the Holocaust kind of dominates just so much of modern Jewish thinking, even today. Everyone has traumas in their past. How much are we going to kind of relitigate them? Say that to the memories of the folks who fought in World War II, fought and died. So speaking to my colleagues, a vote in favor of Mr. Carl is a full-throated endorsement of any and all of these statements. I know everyone cares about the rise of anti-Semitism here and around the United States and around the world. And if you have empathy for the Jewish community, communities experiencing hate, simply tired of advancing nominees who I doubt will be respected on the world stage, you must vote against Mr. Carl's nomination. And I just remember from my father who fought in the war, and so many of my family members. I know he's watching. I know other parents are watching. I know our children are watching. I know the world is watching. And so, where will we stand? Where will we stand? What did they fight for? It matters.
Wow. There's a lot there. Jackie Rosen just suggesting that Jeremy is a Holocaust denier and a Hitler lover. Hitler is just a convenient bad example. Let's go through these accusations. Let's go to the source from where these comments come from. And you at home can be the judge. So Rosen first claims that Carl says Hitler is always the convenient kind of bad example. But if you go back to the podcast, you'll find out that Jeremy is discussing how some Christians and Jews actually fail to understand one another. In particular, he's addressing how some have claimed that Hitler's so-called Christianity contributed to the atrocities in World War II. So this is what Jeremy says. Quote, I do think there's obviously historical things that you can point to. Hitler is always the convenient, kind of bad example for today for many reasons. But Hitler wasn't really a Christian in any way other than the most nominal sense that he felt like he needed to run a Christian country at the time, end quote. So he's not making light of Hitler at all. In fact, he's saying that what Hitler believed was fundamentally anti-Christian. It's anti-Christian. But Rosen and other Democrats too, it wasn't just Rosen, said that Jeremy said Jews love to see themselves as oppressed. Of course, by not so subtle implication, saying Jeremy wants to oppress Jewish Americans, his own family. And Rosen made a big billboard to make Jeremy look extra scary, which, by the way, when you see a giant billboard in a congressional hearing setting, that typically signifies the member of Congress is completely full of it. But let's look at what Carl actually says. All right, let's look at what Jeremy says. Quote, I think this all combines with a variety of things, and the Jews love to see themselves as oppressed, and speaking generally, I want to stress, there's all sorts of, I've known many Jews in my life of all descriptions, and many who would totally reject that, right? He later says, quote, I personally, even when I was Jewish, I found it distasteful, end quote. So what Jeremy is talking about from his own experience growing up in a secular Jewish household and with the Jewish community surrounding him in the Bible Belt next to Christians is that some members of the community stress historical oppression as a key element of identity while others stress Jewish agency and Jewish strength. And we just saw this entire debate play out. We saw this entire debate play out with Robert Kraft's Super Bowl commercial condemning anti-Semitism. No one was saying, oh, it's a bad ad because it says anti-Semitism is bad. No, they were saying it's a bad ad because there's a real debate within the Jewish community about this. And Jeremy is stressing Jewish agency and strength over the Robert Kraft view of anti-Semitism and Jewish identity. But Jeremy was also accused by Democrats of saying Jewish people are a destructive force in American life. Jackie Rosen, quoting Jeremy, says the, quote, overall political stance and sociology of the Jewish community in particular in this century, it's been very destructive overall, end quote. But if you listen to the podcast, Jeremy's comments come in the middle of debunking the conspiracy theory that there is some nefarious cabal of Jewish people running American society. This is what he says, quote, it's literally just a math question of bell curves, right? You can wind up with, as you do when you add one bell curve and then you kind of add the other bell curve on top of that, with population, that's 2.5% of the population that, as is often the case. Like half of the Democratic Party's top donors are Jewish, right? Like this is how you can wind up with these numbers. You get these high percentages just as a matter of math. I'm very critical overall of the political stance and the sociology of the Jewish community, particularly in the 20th century. I think it's been very destructive overall. But I don't think that that's a result of a conspiracy. I just think it's a result of, the simplest explanations are usually the best. End quote. So here, what he's saying is there's no conspiracy. There's nothing conspiratorial about what's going on. It's just preferences. It's just different community ways of living. And as a conservative Jewish person, he says, there's no conspiracy there, obviously. So Jeremy is criticizing, in general, the political stance of the Jewish community he grew up in, because as a conservative Republican, he disagrees with the 7 in 10 Jewish Americans who vote with the Democrat Party. You know, the party of Ilhan Omar and Zohran Mamdani. That Democrat Party. Rosen also says Jeremy believes that Jews are, quote, spearheading a lot of bad causes, end quote. But again, he's criticizing liberals who happen to be Jewish, again, rejecting conspiracy theories about Jewish people, talking as someone who is a conservative and grew up in a Jewish household. Quote, you guys are spearheading a lot of bad causes, right? But, the other side is, it can be flipped. And then there are even the minority of Jews that are conservative. There are a lot of very effective Jewish conservatives out there doing good things, end quote. And just before he says that, which of course was taken out of context by Senator Rosen, he explicitly condemns holding any group, and in this case, Jewish people, collectively responsible. Quote, Jews have been disproportionately represented by a lot in some of the worst political movements of the 20th century and obviously 21st century as well. That doesn't mean, no person should be collectively responsible, end quote. So emphasizing over and over again, that doesn't mean collective punishment. Doesn't mean hating Jews is okay. How many times does he have to say it? Blood guilt and collective punishment is exactly what Carl has been fighting against his entire career. There's another quote. Again, this entire same vein of this podcast. Quote, I reject the strong conspiratorial theorizing. It's just not true. End quote. In that same podcast, which, remember, opened with the condemnation of collective punishment, it ended with a condemnation of what people call the Groypers, which Jeremy's detractors conveniently left out, by the way, right? The Groypers, Jeremy says, are, quote, young, extremely anti-Semitic group that is kind of online. They just begin saying completely ridiculous and absurd things. And that you happen to know, especially if you're from that community, being the Jewish community, well, it's like, well, that's not true, end quote. Later he says, quote, going the Groyper way is just very self-destructive, end quote. And again, to drive the point home, he says right after that, quote, just because somebody's in a community or not, you can't say something about them. You have to treat them as individuals, end quote. They say you can know a man by his enemies, and Jeremy Carl seems to have the right enemies, from Cory Booker to the New York Times. But I've always thought it better to know someone by their friends. And the late Charlie Kirk was a great friend of Jeremy Carl. He was one of the main backers of Jeremy's nomination. And this is what Charlie had to say about Jeremy. Watch.
Jeremy Carl, who's become a really good friend, and he's terrific. New book out called The Unprotected Class: How Anti-White Racism is Tearing America Apart. Before we go into this conversation, everybody, you have to purchase this book. They're going to do their best to censor it, to smear it, to slander it. Check it out, The Unprotected Class. Jeremy, welcome to the program.
Great. Thanks so much. It's wonderful to be on, Charlie.
Jeremy, you do some excellent research. This is a significant accomplishment, and this is really the topic you're not allowed to talk about. I see.
Now, most Republicans on the committee saw right through the Democrats' game here, right? They know they're playing a game. But one Republican, Senator John Curtis of Utah, kind of went along with it. Now, Curtis has come out against Carl's nomination, and Senator Curtis claimed in a statement that, quote, after reviewing his record and participating in today's hearing, I do not believe that Jeremy Carl is the right person to represent our nation's best interests in international forums, and I find his anti-Israel views and the insensitive remarks about the Jewish people unbecoming of the position for which he has been nominated, end quote. Now, in Senator Curtis's line of questioning during the hearing, the statement that he took issue with is, and I assume Curtis is trying to quote Jeremy here, quote, the United States spends too much time and energy on Israel, often to the detriment of our own national interest. So watch this clip.
And as Assistant Secretary for International Organizations, I view one of your core responsibilities to counter the systemic anti-Semitism and anti-Israel bias in international organizations. Israel rarely asks for direct military intervention from the United States, but it does ask for diplomatic support and helping. So in your podcast of October 24, you said the United States spends too much time and energy on Israel, often to the detriment of our own national interest. So share with me specifically what is in the U.S. interest that has been harmed by sustained American support of Israel.
Now, that's a fair question from Senator Curtis, but his quote that the United States spends too much time and energy on Israel, often to the detriment of our own national interests, attributed to Carl, is incorrect. So let's read Jeremy Carl's full quote. Quote, I'm actually, just to be clear, I think I've said it before, like at a basis, I have a very pro-Israel view of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in the abstract. I just don't want us involved in it that much. I mean, it's sort of like, between those two groups, I tend to be much more sympathetic with the Israelis, but what I'm not sympathetic to is the amount of time and energy that America spends on this question, often to the detriment of our own national interest. So Jeremy here is specifically talking about American efforts to solve the Israel-Palestine conflict, which the U.S. has been trying to solve for over 50 years, at least back to the Carter administration, and you could trace it back farther than that if you'd like. And this is squarely in line with the national security strategy of the Trump administration. It's squarely in line in its efforts to broker peace in the region between Israel and its neighbors so that the United States can focus on its near abroad or China. So John Curtis got the quote wrong. He got the context wrong. I guess the question is whether John Curtis will reconsider his opposition, given the accusations made by Democrats against Jeremy Carl, and some of Curtis's accusations against Carl as well, have been shown to be untrue. Will he reconsider? Jeremy's nomination has been pending for 8 months. He joins us today on the Signal Sitdown to discuss. We hope you enjoy. Thank you so much for tuning into the Signal Sitdown, but before we get to the interview, we'd love it if you'd hit that like and subscribe button on YouTube, Spotify, or wherever you may be joining us. And please remember to give us a 5-star review because we love your feedback. Remember, it's your government, and together we'll expose how it really works and how to affect real change. Without further ado, here's the interview. Jeremy Carl, thank you for doing this.
Thanks so much, Bradley. It's a pleasure to be talking with you.
So you are President Trump's nominee for Assistant Secretary of the Bureau of International Organization and Affairs at the Department of State. You were nominated for this position 8 months ago now in June of 2025. So this has been an 8-month process for you. So first, just explain this role, Assistant Secretary of the Bureau for International Organization Affairs. What is this role? Why were you picked to do this job?
Yeah, thanks. And in fact, it's even longer than an 8-month process because June is just when they announced it. Without speaking out of school, before the president was even inaugurated, a senior official in the sort of transition of the State Department approached me and, offered me this role pending approval of the White House. Actually, a few different portfolios that I could have chosen, and this one was the most interesting to me. So basically what this role does is sort of oversees everything that we do at the United Nations and other multilateral organization, and there are literally hundreds of these things. One of the things that the administration is doing right now is a review to sort of cut some of it, sort of right size it, as they say in the business world, so we're not engaged everywhere, but we're still going to be engaged in a lot of places. And then that also includes things like the G7 and the G20 and a whole bunch of other things. So it's really almost without in any way claiming any sort of a similar authority, but it's almost like being a mini Secretary of State because you're really touching just about every element of the international system. So you mentioned some preliminary conversations prior to your nomination. What were those preliminary conversations like? And in the days immediately following, those types of conversations, how does this
progress, because this is real inside baseball for the people at home. They just see when the president sends out the truth nominating somebody, or the nomination is actually sent to the Senate. But there's a lot of work that goes in beforehand.
No, absolutely. And they were working, I can tell you, because I was down in Palm Beach a couple times. I mean, and I had some friends who were involved in the presidential personnel. You know, those guys were working without sleep during the transition period. So it's a very intense time as they're looking at lots of names and lots of positions and looking to really staff up the administration as quickly as they possibly can. So in my particular case, I'm going to, again, be just a little bit vague to not put anybody on the spot, but there were a couple people at the very upper echelons of the State Department who were fans of mine and liked my work. And I was interested in going in. And so those sort of two things came together, and that's how the initial sort of conversations got underway. Then at that point, the White House needs to get involved. And sometimes, of course, these appointments will come from the White House. When I was in Trump 1, it was not in a Senate confirmed role, but it was in another senior role. And that time it was really more the White House pushing me and then the department kind of saying, okay, well, we'll take him. This time it was really the department. And then I was fortunate to have some friends and allies in the White House who spoke for me on my behalf, and then some outside friends who spoke for me on my behalf. And none of those guys, frankly, was bigger than sadly Charlie Kirk, who's of course sadly no longer with us, but was just a big champion of mine in a number of dimensions, and certainly had pushed me for this role. And so again, there's no one. Every process is different, but that was kind of how I came to get this nomination.
Yeah, and Charlie, right after it's clear that Trump has won the election, I mean, Charlie just instantly starts working on all of this type of stuff. I think there was a group, a very committed group, to get the president's personnel a beachhead in the administration on day one. And I think they just spent like the next 12 weeks like flying out election night after we found out the results, and spending the next 12 weeks away from wives and children and family to do that type of research, have those types of interviews, and try to build this administration's personnel. And you being a part of that, Charlie, obviously has spoken many times about your work, your book, The Unprotected Class, talking about institutionalized white racism in the United States, and kind of how then all of a sudden you're going to be transitioning those types of skill sets, that type of research, into a role with the State Department, focusing on these multinational institutions, these international institutions. How do you prepare for something like this? You start meeting with Senate staffers.
Yeah.
I mean, you're in a Senate confirmed position. This is different from your position in Trump 1, which, correct me if I'm wrong, that was with the Department of the Interior.
Right. And that was, sort of I've had a sort of unusual career in that I've done a few different things in discrete buckets. So I spent a lot of time in the environment and energy field, and my graduate work at Stanford was in that. And so my work at Interior was kind of continuing that. You touched on my work on anti-white racism in my book, The Unprotected Class, but I actually did have kind of what I think they described as a happy medium of the sort of experience they were looking for this, in that I spent about a decade as a fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford, and I was the right-hand man kind of the late U.S. Secretary of State George Shultz, who was Reagan's Secretary of State, longest-serving Secretary of State of the 20th century. A very moderate guy, relatively speaking, certainly well to my left, and with a great deal of bipartisan respect. I had also worked under the direction of a Kenyan professor at Harvard, Kalestis Juma, and had worked a little bit in the UN system as a graduate student there. So I did have that and some other things that were kind of relevant background experience, but I think they also did want me, just to kind of finish before I get into the specific issues of how the process works. The person who made me the offer basically said, look, you've shown that you're not a jerk, but you're also not afraid to kind of go kick the hornet's nest where it needs to be kicked. And that's what we need right now in international organizations. We need somebody who's not afraid to be bold, who's going to really push the president's agenda without apology, even if it kind of is not the way we've always done things. And so I think that was why they had looked at me for this particular role. So that's a little bit on my background. As you go for this, you either meet with senators or staffs. I made myself available ever since my nomination to really anybody who'd wanted to meet with me. I was happy to meet with them. I did not meet, I only met with staff, and even there it was only for just a few senators. All the Democrats who were kind of beating me up, there was only one Democrat staff that even met with me. If I were maybe one echelon higher up the totem pole at the undersecretary level, I might have met with members, but it just sort of depends. If a member has a real particular thing in your area, they might meet with you, but otherwise they won't. They'll just have their staff do it. But I met 3 times, flying each time to DC at my own expense, just to meet with the minority staff on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. And those were, as I think diplomats would say, a very candid exchange of views for about 2 hours each. But again, you make yourself available in this process to anybody who wants to talk to you, and that's kind of the formal bit. And then, of course, I was also meeting with a number of people inside the department. I was being briefed, although there are limits, of course, to how they brief you as an outsider, because there's confidentiality issues as well as other similar things. And I'm meeting with relevant groups. So there's a huge preparation that goes into this. And one of the many frustrations, although not a surprise, of the hearing is that all of that preparation I did for the hearing on anything of substance was basically wasted, because all they wanted to do was have the Democrats scream at me about things I'd written in the past they didn't like.
So we're going to get to all those attacks on your character later, but I want to stay on this because this is interesting. We've had folks who are very familiar with the nominations process come on the show before and talk about how a lot of Democrat senators or a lot of Democrat staffers would just refuse to meet with nominees, even sometimes cabinet nominees, right? Yeah. We had Clint Brown, who worked on Kash Patel's confirmation, come on and talk a little bit about those issues. You did meet with Democrat staff, specifically Democrat staff on the Foreign Relations Committee in the Senate. And a lot of these Democrat members, when you got to the committee hearing setting, attacked you. So you said that there was a candid exchange of views. What can you tell us about those meetings? I mean, the number one, the top 2 accusations that were thrown at you in the hearing is that you're a racist and an anti-Semite. Did they ask you about those things? Did you have a candid conversation about that?
I think one illuminating thing is they literally have, for those who watched the hearing, I mean, they had these sort of poster boards of, allegedly horrible things that I had said or tweeted, usually, or written in articles. It was a similar thing when I met with the Democrat staff. I mean, they literally had the dossier of like every tweet that I'd ever tweeted. I mean, it was kind of interesting at that level because, I mean, and to be fair, I mean, it certainly shows the level of scrutiny. And one of the things I didn't have a chance to say it, but I will be clear here, as would obviously be policy. I tweet aggressively as an advocate. That's part of what I do right now. I'm at the Claremont Institute as a fellow. I don't apologize for that. Obviously, when you step into an actual formal government role, your behavior has to be very different. Anything I would actually be putting on social media, if I were confirmed for this position, I'd have a media staff. I'd be running through it. It's not going to be like Jeremy's hot take of the day on X issue. It would all be things that would be relevant to the actual work that I was doing, and it would be vetted. So, again, I didn't even get a chance to say that during the committee hearing, but just to make it clear. But yeah, these things did come up, and there was one particular woman. Again, I want to be a little bit protective of the confidentiality of the process. I mean, I don't know if that's a formal rule, but I think it's the right thing to do. I wouldn't want them sharing everything that I'd said out of school in those meetings either. But certainly these things did come up. Most of the people on the Democrat staff were able to be at least reasonably professional in their interactions with me. There was one, and she was kind of the leader, and she just could not disguise her utter contempt and disdain for my very existence, and was full of sort of name calling and no sort of explanations that I offered of why I felt the way I did, or even, of course, there's a few times in careers of thousands and thousands of tweets that you say things that I'm like, I'm not going to defend that. I shouldn't have said it. Right? It's just like 15 minutes later, I might have tweeted something different, but I tweeted this then, and I'm not going to say that it was the right thing to tweet. But again, none of these sort of explanations really seem to carry much water. And one thing I said in at least two of my kind of preparatory meetings with the Democrat staff, because I could sort of see the direction that they were going, is I said, look, you can try to turn my hearing into a circus, but I'm not going to play the clown for you. And sure enough, they did try to turn my hearing into a circus, but I was pleased that although it took some restraint, because they teach you not to kind of argue with the senators and to kind of keep a very level tone. And I would have happily engaged a little more aggressively if it were just up to me. But I didn't turn it into, I was not the clown in their circus. And so I do have some satisfaction from that.
So even in that setting, even in a more private setting, there were some who were willing to try to tar and feather you as a racist and anti-Semite, but others didn't, which is good.
Yeah.
I mean, that's generally a good thing.
Yeah.
But then their members, of course, in
Yeah.
the hearing, made big billboards and threw them on easels and tried
Yeah.
to take your words out of context. But this is, as I said, has been an 8-month process for you officially as a nominee.
Yeah.
Much longer, even before then. So like a year now.
Yeah.
Your nomination ends up expiring at the end of 2025 because Congress is split into 2 sessions for every sort of 2-year Congress term, right?
Yeah.
And it has to be resubmitted. And so my question for you is, the Senate has changed the rules or created a new precedent that allows nominees to be confirmed in block. Why did your nomination end up expiring in 2025? Why did it have to be renewed in 2026?
Yeah.
Why did that happen? How did it happen?
Well, Bradley, the real answer is I don't entirely know. So I can only sort of speculate. And there were times where I was told, hey, it's happening. It's going to be next week. Buy your plane ticket. And then it just wouldn't happen, right? They have to give you a week's notice, but they actually just have to notice the hearing a week in advance. They don't have to tell you that you're on the agenda quite a week in advance. And I live in Montana, so it was a little bit chaotic trying to get back and forth or doing intense last minute prep for a week and then finding out, it's not actually going to happen. I'm not a DC insider. Okay. I mean, of course I do know people in DC, but I don't know them to the degree that I would if I lived there. So I didn't maybe have that special person who was gonna be the best friends of the committee staffers and make sure that I got on that agenda. I think maybe there were some, certainly the Democrats didn't really want to give me a hearing. I don't think at all, quite frankly. And we're happy to find an excuse not to do that. And so there was delays, but the White House has its own priorities. I don't know. I think there was a desire of some, probably particularly on the Democrat side, to just see if we could smother this in the cradle. And so they let it expire. And at that point, I was so sort of put off by having been told one thing and that thing not happening that I said, well, look, I'm done with this. I'm not to say that I was not willing to still do the work. And I made this clear to my nominations team, but I basically said, call me, I'm not going to call you. And I went for a couple months and was doing other things effectively in between when my nomination expired. But then in January 11th or so, the White House actually did go back and nominate me. And I thank my supporters there and President Trump, and was clearly sending the message that, no, we want this guy. We really want him. Not everybody whose nominations expired were renominated, but they said, we really want this guy. And at that point, I think the committee staff said, okay, well, we've been given our marching orders, and I did get on the first hearing of the year. Didn't necessarily probably work to my advantage, but at least I did get a hearing, and that's all I could ask for.
Yeah, especially after months and months of, is there going to be a hearing? Is there not going to be a hearing? I hope you bought travel insurance and you could cancel your flights for no cost to you. President Trump resubmits the nomination early January. February 9th, I believe, it's announced that there is going to be a hearing.
Yeah.
On February 12th. This is
Yeah.
like a very tight turnaround.
Yeah.
So
it's actually
tell me
written a week in advance, and I was on that, but
Okay.
but then I think
So you were aware a little bit beforehand.
So yeah, so I did
about
have
a
a
week
week
to
this
prepare.
time, but again, that's not a lot of time to do everything and get up to speed. So it's formally, I'm given it. I was told on Thursday, and I'm in Montana, and then Sunday I had to fly, Super Bowl Sunday. So forget the Super Bowl. I had to fly from Montana to Washington D.C. to prepare for all sorts of preparatory meetings for the next 3 days, so that I'd be ready for my Thursday hearing.
So what can you tell us about that, about crunch time, right? You've been preparing for this for a year. You interviewed for the position at the beginning of the administration. You've been talking to your nominations team throughout this process, but now the item is on the calendar and you got to go.
Yeah, so we do what's called murder boards, and those are different sort of permutations. Some of them are individual, and some of them they get your whole panel together that's going to appear so that you can understand what that dynamic is like. And they have staffers sort of impersonate the senators and ask you questions, and those questions can be about the role, it can be about your professional experience, it can be, as it was often in my case, about things that I'd written or tweeted. And they're pretty rough. I mean, they try to do a good job. I had some friends in the White House who'd done one of these informally for me earlier, and it was actually really, really useful. This was months before it actually happened, but they were so brutal to me that by the end of the mock hearing, I was like, man, well, I'm not sure I'd vote for me after that. But that was a good wake-up call, that it was like, okay, this isn't show friends, it's show business, and I need to be prepared. I think sometimes the actual formal hearings, where these guys who are mostly grilling you kind of well at this point, it's a little hard for them to get the true contempt that I ended up getting from the senators. But they do their best, and they try. So those sorts of things happen. And then beyond that, I had meetings with various senior staff in the department to just sort of talk about, well, what am I going to do if I get this role, and just to kind of understand what their concerns were. And because my approach was always actually to emphasize the hearing less than people wanted me to, and actually emphasize when I did these briefings and had people telling me, like, what do I need to do to come in and do this job well? That was always my primary concern, rather than like, what is the song and dance that I'm going to do to impress a senator. So that was the way I approached it, but it's a very involved process.
So before we get into the actual hearing and the accusations thrown around, the filibustering that occurred, I want to know a little bit more about you and your background, because I think it really illuminates the problem that I think a lot of the American people have identified with Congress right now, that it feels like it's all show trials and reality TV. Where are you from?
Yeah.
What kind of household did you grow up in? What type of community are you from?
Yeah, no, thank you for asking. So I grew up in North Carolina. My parents were academics at the University of North Carolina. I actually sort of, contrary, I'm obviously wearing a cross for Ash Wednesday here, but grew up in a Jewish family, which sort of made the sort of anti-Semitism accusations, I don't want to say funny, because there was nothing funny about being accused of it. Frequently, I don't even think the senators knew about my background in many cases. But
it would be news to your mom and dad.
It would be news to my family, who I'm very, very close with, who, even though they do not share my politics, have been incredibly supportive of me throughout the process. It would be news to my many, many Jewish friends, many of whom have defended me both before the hearing and then afterwards. My friend Michael Rubin from the American Enterprise Institute did a very nice piece just yesterday, sort of about the witch hunt, I believe he called it, against me. But anyway, this was all put out there. But I grew up in a fairly secular Jewish family, and then over time, became a Christian, and that became an important part of my life. But I then went to Yale as an undergrad, and then was in the technology world for a while. Then got into the public policy world, lived in India for a while, then came back to the United States, eventually went to Harvard, and then I went to Stanford to do a PhD and in sort of public policy related field. I was then recruited out of that program before I finished my dissertation by the late Secretary of State George Shultz, who was looking for somebody to work with him at Hoover. And I thought, wow, that's kind of a pretty great opportunity. I mean, a really probably long in the past for a lot of your listeners, but for somebody of my age, I'm 53, a legendary figure in Republican policy circles with experience going back to the Eisenhower administration. So, took that and was there for a decade, and then eventually, for personal reasons, not because I didn't love my work at Hoover, but just wanted to get out of California, joined the Claremont Institute, which has been my employer for the last 6 or 7 years, also a wonderful sort of think tank, and have been working there since then. My work, up until the point I left Hoover, had actually generally been much more conventional, shall we say, sort of very conventional policy type analysis, sort of dry academic books, a lot of formal, very high level conferences with other secretaries of state or things like that. When I got to the Claremont Institute, I took the advantage of being able to be a little bit more forward, and I wrote this book, The Unprotected Class, among many other things that I did, and that was on the rise of anti-white racism in the United States. That book received quite a lot of attention in public policy circles on our side of the aisle, both inside and outside the administration. I can tell you that it was influential on some of the things that this administration has done with policy. My friend Harmeet Dillon, at the Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights at DOJ, doing some outstanding work, and her team. But it definitely raised my profile, but it was obviously a radioactive sort of issue to take on. And so it and everything around it and other things that I'd written about race and culture made me a more radioactive figure to the left. And that's kind of, a lot of the allegedly lifetime of horrible things that I had done are really all just things that happened in the last 6 or 7 years as I began writing about these sort of different subjects.
So I just want to take a step back for a second. So you grew up in a secular Jewish family. Your parents were academics at Chapel Hill in North Carolina. And you're living in a secular Jewish household in the Bible Belt.
Yes.
Right. So what's that like?
Yeah. Well, Chapel Hill, even back then, and I think it's even more so today, was sort of the pat of butter in the sea of grits, as I think they like to call it. I mean, it was a more kind of liberal and cosmopolitan place. Now, we were still definitely North Carolina in a million different ways. And in fact, I was friends and still am with people who were related pretty closely to Billy Graham. So that was out there. But it definitely was a place that was maybe a little more used to outsiders. But I definitely got some religious questions at times that you would get only if you're in the Bible Belt, about maybe from people who didn't kind of have a context. And this is, growing up in the 1980s for even sort of what Judaism really is as a religion. So occasionally that would happen. But I think in general, as is always the case with the vast majority of Christians in America, any religious difference was always treated respectfully. I always felt welcome and part of the community. And, it was a wonderful place to grow up.
So there's a Jewish community, of course, near UNC Chapel Hill. There's also, of course, Christian communities there.
Yeah.
I mean, did those communities, it seems like, but from what you just said, that they got along?
Yeah. I mean, the Jewish community back then was not particularly large. In fact, there was no synagogue in Chapel Hill. We had to go like 15 miles to Durham to go to a synagogue. So it wasn't that there was that many Jewish people in Chapel Hill at that point, but there were certainly some. Again, the communities got along. It was a friendly place to be, and I think it was really kind of a look back to an earlier part of America. And again, I've been very critical of mass migration. It's one of the things I mentioned in my hearing, and it's something that I think has been the real core factor that has changed so much of America. But whatever our religious background is, in the 1980s. This is like sort of pre-mass immigration. I mean, everybody in Chapel Hill, to a first approximation, was either white or black and mostly had pretty deep roots in the United States. I mean, again, it obviously depends from person to person, but there was a great sense of kind of overlap and cultural kinship, regardless of whether you were a Baptist or a Presbyterian or even Jewish, or if you were white or you're black. There are certain things with foods or other things that would actually be quite similar. And so it was a friendly place. People got along. There was certainly not a great deal of religious tension or racial tension or anything like that. Again, I'm not saying things were perfect, but they were just, when I compare it to America today, it's like night and day.
Mm-hmm. So I can tell by the ashes on your forehead today that you are a Christian now as an adult, and you don't convert. And from my understanding, from what we've talked about, you don't convert until later in your life.
Yeah.
What was that process like for you? Why did you end up becoming a Christian?
Yeah, a great question, and probably a longer story than I'll just give you the very abbreviated version. But I stress this. I mean, I've got one of my kids in particular. We go to a PCA church, so a sort of conservative Presbyterian denomination. And I have one son who is like particularly passionate about these things and about doctrine. And the thing that I stressed to him was that the real first steps for me in my own conversion were not because I listened to Christian doctrine and I was like, wow, that's absolutely right. I'm completely convinced. It was really the fruits. So I had a couple of roommates at Yale my freshman year who became evangelical Christians. And this was not typical. I can only kind of view this as the providential hand of God on me myself that this happened, that I was exposed to this. And what I saw through getting to be friends with them was that really, I mean, Yale is, I think, maybe like DC although in a somewhat different way. It's a very intense place. It's a place where people get very full of themselves. You're being told you're special all the time. You are kind of special in certain ways. I mean, they're very talented people there. It's a place where it's very easy to lose your sense of perspective. And the people at Yale who I encountered who kept that sense of perspective were Christians. And I'm not saying they were the only people, but like in great disproportion. And so that those fruits and the way that they behaved were sort of the first kind of stirrings for me. And then it was a longer journey. I married a practicing Christian. That was not enough. I mean, I had to actually believe it. That was not going to make me convert. But church was a part of our family's life. And it just sort of happened. There was no one Paul on the road to Damascus type moment for me, but it was just an accretion of things over time, and that I ultimately came to accept Christian truth. And so I then converted. And in a Jewish community, that can be very fraught. Again, my own parents have been wonderful. They're very accepting.
But turning now to the hearing. Okay, so you get in this hearing, and you're ready to talk about some pretty important stuff. Transparency at the United Nations, reforms that need to be put in place, what American policy can do about it. And you really are only given your opening statement to provide a brief overview of what you'd like to do with this role and the kind of problems that we see in international institutions right now.
Right.
And so I want to give you the opportunity to speak a little bit more at length about this. What's going on in these multinational institutions?
Right.
What reforms are necessary? What can American policy do about it? And,
right.
and how is this undercutting the U.S. national interest?
Well, thanks. I mean, again, huge topic. Would have loved to have had the opportunity to address it at length in the hearing, and I didn't because the Democrats on the committee turned it into a circus. But I think there's a few things. I mean, one, everybody from both parties gets frustrated about how the UN in particular works. Totally understandable. They're actually correct. But we also have to understand, partially that's a function of the UN being the UN. It is, by definition, a place that includes everyone. It's going to include countries that are not friendly to us. It gives greater power to smaller countries and less influential countries than sort of standard international bilateral relationships were. So it's not kind of designed, the UN system, to be something that the U.S. can perfectly manipulate to our own ends. I mean, now, certainly, if confirmed, I'm going to be as aggressive as possible about pursuing an America First agenda in the UN system, but there are limits to what you're going to be able to do. And I think part of a little bit of wisdom here is just understanding, really what the value is here is it's good to have a place where everybody, including countries that do not have diplomatic relationships with each other, can meet and have some sort of at least formalized conversations about things. I think that's useful. As President Trump has said on many occasions, and he's completely correct, I mean, the United Nations grew out of literally the Second World War. It's founded in 1945. The idea is to keep the peace. And it's sort of metastasized into this global governance org with thousands of liberal bureaucrats, and that's what we need to be pushing back on. But that sort of basic idea as a kind of fundamental entity to keep the peace is still a good one. There are about, I think, 56 standards bodies, from the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, to the International Telecommunications Union, that again, just by the very nature of them, have to include pretty much everybody. And again, so the United Nations is a natural home for that. If I were confirmed, I want to make sure that the U.S. has maximal influence in those bodies. We want to be sure that we're aggressively countering Chinese influence. And in general, I would say kind of, and then I'll leave it with this and turn it back to you. There's sort of this horseshoe I've observed as I've gotten to talk to more people in and around the UN system, which is the people who hate the UN the most and the people inside the UN kind of want the UN doing the same things, which is this sort of maximal talking shop, moralizing, not really accomplishing all that much that it's really supposed to be doing. I'm sort of in the middle where and this is my understanding of what the president wants as well, want the UN to be focused, and these multilateral institutions in general, on a more limited set of things, more closely related to the kind of ideas of its founding, and to actually do those things well and to have real effect, and that when the UN speaks on something, there's actually some teeth involved, and all the big powers have gotten together and said, hey, we're gonna do this. And I think it's not something that if I'm confirmed, I'm just going to be able to snap my fingers and do. But I think that over time, it is something that we can move toward. And that would certainly be my goal if I'm confirmed.
So there are some senators who genuinely want to talk to you about this stuff, but some of the Democrat senators decided that they were just going to label you a racist, an anti-Semite, a misogynist, and just generally an overall all-around bigot. Now, some of them didn't ask you any questions at all, and while they were saying these things. Some did ask you questions, but some of the questions were very much in the vein of, when did you stop beating your wife? And Ranking Member Shaheen kind of set the stage with this in her opening statement, which I want to quote. She says you have made, quote, comments promoting racial supremacy, end quote. But of course, she didn't specify what those comments were in her opening statement. So I'll just ask you point blank, do you believe in racial supremacy?
No. And I mean, this is just one of these fascinating things where the Democrats can just, they seem to think that you can claim something, just say, if you say something 50 times, it will somehow become true. And I was actually really reflecting on this on Ash Wednesday service this morning, because it just, like, we're called to repent, and they're putting on the ashes, and they say, out of dust you came and to dust you shall return. And I'm sort of thinking, as I couldn't help but think a little bit about these senators, and that they're simply doing this sort of thing with no sense that could have, not just, let's leave aside the temporal consequences of lying, but there are eternal consequences to characterizing somebody in a false way, in that way. And so they can choose to be blithe about that. Again, I was prepared for how they were going to behave. It didn't bother me. I think it bothered my friends, particularly my non-political friends, who are maybe not used to seeing that a little bit more. But the casualness with which I was frankly slandered by some of these senators was really something. And that being said, of course, I like my own culture. I like my own community. I'm not walking away from that. I made very clear that I was not in any way walking away from my statements against the anti-white racism and discrimination that I've documented. I'm not walking away from the idea that mass migration and lots of diversity is ultimately bad for society, and that it weakens the kind of bonds that hold us together. So it's not that, but that's a very, very different question than racial supremacy or being a misogynist or being an anti-Semite or some of these other sorts of labels that they threw around to attack me.
Shaheen later says in her opening statement that she finds your, quote, views about women particularly concerning, end quote. But again, she didn't elaborate in her opening statement. She would later specify in her individual round of questioning to you what she means. She claims that you have argued, quote, feminism has led to a downfall in American society, end quote, and that, quote, a post-feminist America is one of falling fertility, rapidly rising out of wedlock births, and religious collapse, end quote. Now, for the latter, I mean, obviously this is true numerically. Like, you can verify this with the data. Since The Feminine Mystique was published in 1963, we've seen the fertility rate collapse by half. It used to be over 3, and now it's hovering at around 1.5, 1.7. And if you look at rising out of wedlock births, used to be, you know, less than 10% of births happened out of wedlock. Now we're looking at around upwards of 35% of births happening out of wedlock. And then on the final, the religious collapse, it used to be around 5% of the U.S. population in 1963 were religious nuns, right? N-O-N-E-S, not N-U-N-S, sadly. And today, that number is at almost 30% of the American population. So all these things are like verifiably true by the data, but she never gave you an opportunity to actually respond to these comments. So I'd like you to give you a chance to do that now. Right there.
Yeah. No, of course. I mean, I completely stand by that. And it was sort of all the things that they put up, and they led with this. This was like my first parade of horribles. I was just fascinated by that one because I was like, well, yes, this is true. And furthermore, to criticize feminism is not to be anti-women. I mean, again, if you look at the popularity of feminism, I'm not going to try to pull numbers off the top of my head, but I mean, there's a huge percentage of people who are quite critical of feminism. I mean, my own wife is a very successful physician. She's somebody I met at Yale. My mother was also, I mean, she was an academic and did those things. I mean, the notion that I am somehow against women doing things in society or that I'm anti-women, there's nothing they could point to. I'm a critic of a particular ideology called feminism that I think tries to erase important distinctions between men and women. But that doesn't mean that I'm against women in any way or that I'm threatened by powerful women or whatever have you. And again, this was maybe the one, I almost wasn't even bothered by it because it was just sort of so out of the blue line of questioning. I was expressing views that I think huge percentage of people actually hold, and I'd said them in a very straightforward fashion. And this,
including your wife, the Yale-educated physician who has the mother of your 5 children. Yeah. She might take issue with Betty Friedan calling the family a comfortable concentration camp, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And she's a big critic of feminism, and not because she's a critic of women. But yeah, I mean, I guess this for the Democrats, you know, those two things are the same.
Mm-hmm. Shaheen also said that you're a racist. She said, quote, in 2024, you wrote that you want America to be a Christian nation, and you continued to make anti-Semitic and racist comments even after your nomination was announced last year, end quote. So she's saying that saying America is a Christian nation is racist.
Yeah.
Is it racist to say that America is a Christian nation? What is the evidence for America being a Christian nation?
Yeah, no, and I don't even know where she's getting that direct quote. I mean, I have contributed. This is not a core area of what I do.
You'll be willing to own that one, even if it's wrong?
Yeah, I mean, I think in the following way, I'll own it, right? Like, I want to be very specific, right? Like, we have an origin in Christianity, and I think it's good when there is more Christian influence on America's governance. I have not described myself as a Christian nationalist. So, I mean, I do want to distinguish myself. It's not that I think that's an illegitimate point of view. It's just not one that I personally happen to hold. But I do think in the sense that acknowledging America's Christian roots, Christian culture, Christian heritage is good things. I would like to have more Christian influence on the government. I think that's all a good thing. That's not a statement of hostility toward anybody else. It's just an acknowledgement of our history, of our traditions on what for me is also, of course, the actual truth of Christianity, and saying that I want that within its appropriate constitutional limits, represented in our government. It's really that simple.
Senator Jackie Rosen then took up the mantle. She the baton was passed, and she did not ask a single question of you.
Yeah.
Instead, she took her entire time attacking you, attacking your politics, attacking your identity.
Yeah.
She, and she's attacking you in terms that are supposed to not only end your nomination, but end your career. This is like the de Tocquevillian. What happens in a democracy is you're not killed, but you're sent to the hinterlands.
Right.
You're kind of pushed out of polite society. I just want to read you this quote. Quote, Mr. Carl's vile anti-Semitic comments are very real, end quote. She also says that, quote, some may try to excuse Mr. Carl's remarks, claiming his words were taken out of context, that he never said them, and that his own heritage protects him from criticism. So let me be clear. Identity does not excuse anti-Semitism. Identity does not excuse racism. Identity does not excuse hateful rhetoric, regardless of who says them. End quote. So first, it's not an excuse when someone malevolently takes your words out of context. I mean, they've just been factually wrong about what you believe and what you say.
Correct.
And of course, the context that's missing in her line of attack here is what we discussed previously, that you grew up in a secular Jewish household, very close Christian communities and Jewish communities, and they're all interacting. And she left that part out conveniently, like what particular identity, what particular history you have.
Yeah.
So I wanted to give you the opportunity, since she didn't give you a chance to respond to these accusations. I mean, what do you say to Senator Rosen?
Yeah, again, I mean, obviously, I just completely disagree with her characterization of both me and my comments. I'd say beyond that, one thing, again, it didn't come up in the hearing because it was hard to get it a word edgewise. As you noted, Senator Rosen didn't even give me an opportunity to respond. But I would say at least half of my controversial comments actually came on a podcast I was having with another Jewish convert to conservative Reformed Christianity, who has actually been a real leader in fighting anti-Semitism in conservative Reformed communities. Not that that's an epidemic, but it's out there like it is in other communities. And one of the things that he's done is been a real leader there. We had such a similar background. Literally, the rabbi who bar mitzvahed him married my parents like 61 years ago. So we were having this very informal, and when we were being critical at times, and when I was being critical, it was very much, as I said in our earlier conversation, it's kind of almost from this insider familiarity. We're not saying, oh, this is like some terrible group of people. We're just saying, hey, these were problems that maybe we noticed when we were there, and we're speaking in a kind of very free and informal way on this frankly pretty small podcast. It's really more, we were these two people of Jewish backgrounds having this remarkably similar journey. And so we're having this very formal, candid conversation about that journey. And then again, that was probably the source of like half of the parade of horribles comments that they wanted to circulate.
So she then tries to make you out to be a Holocaust denier.
Right.
And I'm going to quote again.
Yeah.
Quote, in discussing the Holocaust, where 6 million Jews, almost half the Jewish population alive at the time, were slaughtered, an event that continues to be denied to this day, you say, Jackie Rosen referencing you, Jeremy,
yeah,
the Holocaust kind of dominates just so much of modern Jewish thinking even today. Everyone has traumas in their past. How much are we going to kind of relitigate them? End quote. So again, point blank, do you deny the Holocaust happened? Were you trying to belittle the Holocaust when you said this? What was the context?
Not at all. And again, this is where I said, and these were the only comments I got the opportunity to explicitly say, these sorts of debates happen within the Jewish community, but I should have realized that even in the context of those podcasts, I shouldn't have said that loosely. And I think the other problem with reason why, I'd sort of be out there is I have a little bit of a different experience. I'm a 6th generation American. My family's been in America for a long time. Very thankfully, the Holocaust, which I've described as, really one of the great crimes of modern history, did not directly affect my family in any way. We'd all been in the U.S. For many decades. And I understand how if you're somebody whose parents or grandparents were somehow involved in the Holocaust, and that is true for a great number of members of the Jewish community. Like those comments are going to read differently. So again, I was overly casual there, and I shouldn't have been, and I apologized for that in the hearing. But in no remote way was I even denying the reality of the Holocaust, nor that it was one of the great crimes of history. And again, the people who actually knew me, they all understood this. I mean, the president's envoy for global anti-Semitism has been wonderful. He's been incredibly supportive. Our very pro-Israel ambassadors at the UN have all been very supportive of my candidacy. There have been lots of people. Literally, like the only people pushing this sort of stuff are people who don't know me. There's nobody who's out there that I'm aware of. I mean, maybe they'll now surface and say this. There's not a single person out there who actually knows me who's saying, yeah, you know what, that Jeremy guy, I know him. He's like a vicious, bitter anti-Semite. He really hates Jews. You know, he hates these other groups. It's all, I mean, one of the actually truly gratifying things about the process has been all of the negative comments about me are from people who don't know me. And I've gotten so much wonderful support from people who do know me. It's a little bit like going to your own funeral and having people read eulogies for you. I mean, it's really nice. I mean, sometimes people have said things, I'm like, man, that's too nice. I mean, I'm not that great of a guy, but it's been really wonderful to see the support I've had from just a huge variety of people from all sorts of different backgrounds in the conservative movement, even people who really don't like each other and who have all said very nice things about me. And it's really, that to me is so much more valuable than, okay, you know, the Democrats are saying really mean things about me and that's in the paper, but that's not reality. None of those guys even know me at all. They didn't even take a meeting with me. So how could I take their words that seriously?
So I want to ask you, I want to return to the hearing in a moment, but so after the hearing, did you have old friends reach out to you, you know, people reach out to say like, wow, Jeremy, I did not know any of this about you.
Yeah.
You know, did they condemn you? What was, you know, did old friends come out of the woodwork and say, wow, this politics stuff is different?
Yeah. I think I'd sort of been known by my friends at this point that I have like a little bit of a different political view, certainly than the liberals. So I don't think anybody was super shocked. I think, but I think maybe some of the comments were certainly unknown to folks because most people are not forensically, you know, examining long deleted tweets. That's not how most people choose to live their lives, other than committee Democrats, I guess. But, you know, again, the vast majority of people who reached out to me just did so to be supportive, to say, we think you're great, you're our friend. Even if they didn't agree with me about political stuff, they reached out in a supportive way, like, hey, we feel really bad that you're going through this. And what I told those people, again, genuinely, is it is more painful for you to watch than it was for me to experience, because I wasn't expecting anything different than what happened, sadly. But yeah, people did reach out. You know, nobody's reached out who actually knows me with like an apocalyptically, oh my gosh, I can't believe you. You know, I'm never going to be friends with you again. Now, you know, maybe those people do exist and they just quietly remove themselves, but I haven't had anything like that, thankfully. And I have good friends, and particularly in and around my church, and they know who I am. They know my character. I did have a brief point where they were really beating me up, and I mentioned that I was a Calvinist, and then they stopped me. But what I was going to say, had they not stopped me, is that I actually know that I'm worse than all the things that you're saying. And that I can only be saved through the grace of faith through Christ. And so I'm not really, you know, I wish you were sort of accusing me of all the terrible sins that I do commit every day, because we're all, ultimately as humans, we are sinful people. But you know, whatever, you're saying these other sins that I didn't actually commit, but you know, I'm not trying to say that I'm some wonderful person. I am, in fact, beyond redemption, except through faith, at least as we believe, as in my section of the world. But again, I was cut off, didn't even get a chance to make that point. So,
well, amen. And you know, this is, I have to ask this question, and it's sad that I do. You know, you knew Charlie, I knew Charlie,
yeah.
And when the rhetoric is everybody I don't like is a Nazi, and also wink, wink, nod, nod, you know, we punch Nazis, we kill Nazis. Has there been any random people on the internet reaching out and threatening you? And, how do you feel safe and secure?
Yeah. So I've had some negative phone calls that I have maybe they would have turned into threats, but I just cut them off at the pass. I have not seen any actual threats of violence online, but I have to say I'm not going and looking for them. Again, we have a limited amount of time on Earth, and that's not how I want to spend mine. Certainly if somebody brings a credible threat to my attention, I'll deal with it. We have had at Claremont in general, where we kind of tend to push the envelope, we have had some credible threats issued against us and our staff. We actually had even people show up at offices at times. So it's not, we don't take it lightly. I'll be a little bit vague, but I do exercise my Second Amendment rights. And so we do.
You live in Montana.
We live in Montana, highest percentage of firearms owners in the country is just a point of fact. So, but at the same time, I'm not going to live in a fortress, right? And so, we're out there and potentially people could go out there and do harm. And I worry more for my kids and my wife. And I'd say that in general is always my view. My wife she's not a political person at all, but she's been always incredibly supportive of me. But they bear some significant portion of this burden, and none of them asked for it. None of them, none of them deserve it. And so that's something that weighs on me. But ultimately, I decided that even though that's reality, that the things that I'm advocating for are important enough to take those sorts of risks and deal with that. And again, my family, both my birth family and my wife and my kids have been incredibly supportive. And I'm really grateful for that, obviously, because it's not something that you can take for granted.
Back to the hearing, you one senator who did let you respond to some of the accusations levied against you was Senator Chris Murphy. And it was kind of funny watching the hearing where you're like, well, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. We're actually going to talk about my ideas. We're actually going to let me respond at some length
right.
About some of the claims being made against me. And, Senator Murphy, you can agree with me or disagree with me at the end of the day, but at least there's a conversation happening.
Yeah.
Your takeaways from your exchange with Senator Chris Murphy, who said your nomination was heartbreaking to him.
Right. Well, I think, the interesting thing, and this is where they seem to feel like they've gotten this victory. I had some very good online clips of them sort of excoriating me at length and me saying, no, yes, sir, that's what I believe, and not apologizing for it. And those went viral on our side of the internet, and that was great. But at one point, he really focused on asking me about white identity and white culture. And I've tweeted about this subsequently, and this sort of became a topic online. You never get to choose what you're famous for. And I was a little hesitant for a variety of reasons. One is we are taught in the hearing to not be confrontational with the senators. You're not a lawyer trying to argue a point. You're trying to evade arguments. But the second is that it's actually not, white identity and white culture are not, at least under those terms, are not something that I've devoted a lot of writing to. I've devoted a ton of time to talking about anti-white discrimination, anti-white racism. I've spent a lot of time talking about immigration and its effects on our common American culture. But I haven't, I've used the term white culture just like 2 or 3 times. I did a couple of AI searches on all of my tweets, all of my writings. It came up 2 or 3 times. Similarly with white identity, when I typed that into ChatGPT, it said, really the only times that Carl uses this is when he criticizes the extremes of white identity politics. So it wasn't really something that I've advocated. Now, subsequently, there have been people who've come out and had interesting contributions where they've said, yes, there is a white culture. Maybe if it's not you can argue about whether it's the perfect label for it, and there is a white identity in America. And those are fine. And that's really interesting. And I'm happy to talk about that. But it's never been, Murphy was really drilling in on this as if it was the focus of what I've written about. And it's been peripheral at best. And it's not language that I've used. And so I was just a little bit puzzled by his line of inquiry.
Well, yeah. And you also are trying to deal with a really complex historical topic, which is, kind of the 4 main groups who end up settling the American colonies are the Cavaliers and the Scotch Irish and the
Right.
Puritans and the Quakers and all of these groups, different ethnically, different religiously.
Sure.
But it's this early melding of all of those cultures
Sure.
that produce American common culture. And
Yeah.
so, yeah, you can call it European if you'd like. You can call it white, I guess. But like,
Yeah.
there's gradations to that, of course. There's
Yeah.
like non-whites, of course, there with them at the time. And
Right.
so you're trying to unpack, like, the point is they're trying to not let you unpack these complex historical
Of course.
ideas.
Of course.
They don't want you to actually say that. They just want to say
Yeah.
their piece and kind of get out of there. And the perfect example of this from the hearing was Cory Booker. Cory Booker tries to let you talk a little bit, but I mean, he can't help himself.
Yeah.
And first, I just want to ask, like, I don't remember seeing Cory Booker there at the beginning of the hearing. Was Cory Booker at the entire hearing?
Oh, no. I mean, these guys go in and out. I mean, again, one of the most useful pieces of advice I did get from my team is that it's theater, it's performance. So I don't think anybody other than the chairman and ranking member were there for the entire hearing. And really, I mean, Senator Rosen literally sauntered in, gave her 5 minutes, and I don't quote me on this, but you can look at the video. I think she may have left essentially immediately. And other people were, if she was there for a few more minutes, right? They are there for their YouTube clips. That's what they're there for, their Instagram clips. And so you just have to accept that as that's the way the process works. I knew that Senator Booker was going to be extremely animated in his approach. That's kind of what he tends to do. So I was ready for it. And I just attempted to respond to that by being calm and stating my views as much as I can. And when he gave his sort of soliloquy, maybe I should have stepped in and interrupted him, but I just kind of let him do it. And, that was him talking to his guys, but I don't think it's going to ultimately have an effect.
Well, the whole MO of these things is like, try to let it go off without incident, as you've kind of tipped off. But that's like, you talk to any nominee at any level, that's kind of their point. Like the boring hearing is the good hearing.
Yes.
For a nominee at least. But it's truly psychopathic behavior for someone to come in for 10 minutes, like cool as a cucumber, try to destroy someone's character and reputation, and then get up, walk out, grab a coffee, and go to the next meeting. I mean, that's like just only people in Washington, D.C., man.
Yeah.
That's the way that things happen here.
Yeah, I mean, it really came down to it, and this is why I wasn't as disturbed, is at the end of the day, my identity is in Christ, or at least I try to have it be that. And so it's like these things that these people are saying to me, I mean, boy, I wish they were saying nice things. At some level, it's just maybe useful for you narrow your friend group to the people who actually care about you, right? Like people who are going to, who don't know, like if you've spent time with me and you think that those things could possibly be true about me, then, we're good to not be friends, right? Like I think anybody who's spent any amount of time with me knows that this is just a absurd characterization of who I am as a person. And so it didn't bother me, the accusations, even though obviously they'll have some negative practical effects.
So I want to point you towards one thing that Cory Booker asked you, Senator Booker asked you. He asked you, quote, "Do you think that America would be weaker if it was, say, 40% Jewish," end quote. To which you respond, quote, "Absolutely not in and of itself," end quote. So he then interrupts you and asks why you qualified that statement before you can jump in and say, like President Trump, I believe unity is our strength.
Right.
The guy who's kind of
Right.
racial discrimination in universities tends to be the guy who's like not in love with quota systems. That tends to not work out well
Right.
for anybody,
Right.
including in arguments in front of the Supreme Court. But do you think Cory Booker has ever been asked if America would be weaker if the population was, say, 5% black, and not by violence or anything like
Right.
that, just by the nature of changing demographics over time? Do you think he's ever been asked that?
No, I'm sure he has. And I think in most of these cases, what really comes across to me as somebody who has thought about these issues quite a bit is how little the Democrats seem to have even really thought about these types of issues in any sort of serious way. And certainly they're never confronted with hostile questions about that. And again, my views on diversity are that it's bad in large amounts, not because the people who are bringing it are bad, but just because it's a challenging thing to manage. You've got different groups, they want different things. You obviously don't want absolute uniformity. That's kind of some weird militaristic fascist state. But in general, when a country has more people with more in common, that's a good thing.
No one will ever ask Cory Booker that question.
No, of course not.
What do you think his response would be if I went up to Cory Booker and I said, would America be weaker if it was only 5% black?
Yeah. I mean, I don't want to speculate on what his response would be, but I suspect, I mean, I just don't like it. That's,
my perspective here is,
you can speculate because you're not enough.
Well, I will speculate. I mean, he after all said in his long filibuster speech last year that Black history is American history. And so I would only have to assume that if Black history is American history, Cory Booker would have to say, yes, America would be weaker. And this is the point that conservatives are trying to make. Right. You're playing this stupid game and you're trying to win stupid prizes. Right. Enough with judging people on the basis of their skin color, enough with the blood guilt, enough with the collective punishment, enough with the quota system. Now, I do want to ask you about one Republican senator who I presume you're still trying to win over to vote for your confirmation. That is Senator John Curtis of Utah. Yeah. You guys had an interesting exchange. He has since come out against your nomination. He asked you a series of pointed questions. Yeah. But time was short. There's a lot of crosstalk happening, and so I want to just ask you some of the questions that Senator Curtis asked you and let you talk a little bit more at length.
Sure.
Because he did tend to interrupt you a few times. So he pointed to one of your claims that, quote, the United States spends too much time and energy on Israel, often to the detriment of our own national interests. Now, in my monologue, I pointed out that's an inexact quote that Senator Curtis brought to your attention. You actually say something different in that October 2024 podcast, talking about the Israel-Palestine issue, which has been a focal point of U.S. diplomacy for over 50 years, at least since the Carter administration, depending on where you want to draw the lines. But he asks you, share with me specifically what is in the U.S. interests that has been harmed by sustained American support of Israel. Do you view diplomatic support as important or critical, or does that fall into the too much time and energy sphere? Now, this obviously is referencing your role at the United Nations, which you and I have both pointed out is a hive of scum and villainy and a lot of anti-Semitism.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, I mean, I'd say a couple of things. And again, I don't want to speculate too much about Senator Curtis, but again, there's a lot of crosstalk. There's media that's out there before my hearing. There's whatever limited things he's being given. And then we get just a few minutes, right? And so I understand. I'm going to be understanding and just assume that he's coming to that from very good faith, that he has these questions and concerns. I wouldn't necessarily presume he even knew my background in the way that we talked about it. Certainly not in the depth that we've talked about it here. And what I'm hoping is that I get a chance to get in front of the senator at some point and just sort of give some more context around that, a context around, again, like, oh yeah, I gave this guy remarked on the podcast where the guy who was the podcaster was bar mitzvahed by the guy who married my parents, right? Like, this is not some anti-Jewish thing. But in the context of Israel, what I would say is, I mean, a few things. Proof in the pudding. Like Charlie Kirk and George Shultz, who were like two huge supporters of mine, were about as pro-Israel people as you could possibly imagine. And they never would have, Charlie Kirk would never have supported me for this position if he thought I were against a strong U.S.-Israel relationship. Secretary Shultz would never have kept me in his employ for a decade if he thought I were anti-Israel. So I'd say those things, again, are super pro-Israel. UN ambassadors are all unanimously supporting me, as is our envoy addressing anti-Semitism. Again, like, that's kind of a better indicator. I would think those people have all had a chance to talk to me at length. And I think it's a better indicator of like their assessment of what I would do in this role than some podcast clip from, X time ago that was truly, it really was taken out of any sort of context. But yeah, like especially in the context of the UN, this is an area where we are the ally that Israel has in that system, right? Because otherwise it's just brutal. I've made it really clear that the anti-Semitism in the UN is pervasive. It's a huge problem. That I would fight against it if I were in this role. And then I would say, one of the main things I would like to do in this role, if I'm confirmed, is to really go after the International Criminal Court. And we've actually been in the Trump administration, I shouldn't say the Trump administration has been very aggressive in putting sanctions on the judges of this so-called court. So this is the most aggressive thing. We're not just not in it, but we're really attacking its fundamental legitimacy. Now, we're worried about that from a national interest perspective. But also, the court has really gone after Netanyahu and other people in the Israeli government. So this is, I think, a high priority for Israel, and it's a super, super high priority for me. So I think if you just look at practically the people vouching for me, the people who supported me over the years, and what I would do in this role, I think that you can feel comfortable enough. Maybe Senator Curtis is never going to love me or be 100% with me. I'm not going to, although I'd love to have that be the case, but that he can trust the president's judgment and the rest of these people's judgment enough to make sure that I am able to get out of committee and onto the Senate floor for a vote.
Mm-hmm. So you referenced it a little bit. Where do things go from here for you as we wrap this up?
Well, I think we're still assessing, where we are. That's kind of, there's sort of these questions for the record that are happening afterwards, and my nominations team is working on those, and they're talking to Senate offices, and Senator Daines, who I know very well, my own senator from Montana, who introduced me, he's been very helpful. There are other senators. I don't want to kind of out people within this process because it's still a process, but I will say that there are multiple other senators who know me. Some on the committee who have gone to be helpful and have said that they're willing to spend some significant energy on my nomination to really make sure that it goes forward. Right now, I'm still having conversations with people, and we're just assessing where senators are. And I'm hoping that at the end of that, we're going to just find that we have, maybe one, maybe two senators that I kind of need to do some work with, and then I'll do that. But that's sort of a process that is ongoing right now. I'm obviously not expecting support from the Democrats. The Democrats have given, maybe 1-2 votes to even our least controversial nominees in many cases in the committee. So I'm certainly not, we need to keep the Republicans unified. And again, I would certainly hope that Senator Curtis would take that into mind, that, we certainly have a unanimity of opposition. And so as possible, we need to stay together. And I think if he or anybody else looks at the totality of my record and the totality of way that I deal with people and with the many people throughout our coalition who know me well, who've spoken on my behalf, that ultimately that will carry a lot of weight.
Jeremy Carl, thank you for coming on the Signal Sitdown.
Thank you so much, Bradley. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for tuning into the Signal Sitdown. Before you go, be sure to hit like and subscribe on YouTube, Spotify, or wherever you may be joining us. And please remember to give us a 5-star review. We not only love your feedback, but it really does help the show. Remember, it's your government, and together we'll expose how it really works. See you next time.